Josh Goldberg here. Today I'm talking about emotional neglect from childhood, how that affects a person and how it affects their relationships and their life. So emotional neglect from childhood is basically a child that goes emotionally invalidated by their parents or primary caregivers throughout their childhood life. The parents, even if they are present, if they are around, can be emotionally neglectful and emotionally invalidating if they're too busy, with their business or with moving around the country. Anything that occupies the parents too much and they emotionally are not there for the child, and they emotionally neglect the child. If the parents are abusive, obviously there's no emotional validation going on if there's abuse happening. Abuse is always emotionally invalidating. If the parents have health issues and they're busy dealing with them, the child can be left emotionally invalidated. If the parents get a divorce, often divorces take a long time, and while the parents are working through a divorce, the children are often left emotionally invalidated. The children are having a lot of emotions that the parents are not validating, which can certainly be emotionally neglectful. Or the parents are themselves emotionally unavailable, which means that their parents were emotionally neglectful to them. Emotional neglect does actually get passed down from parent to children. It's a generational abuse. Emotional neglect is a generational abuse. Until a person actually is able to break the cycle, it does get passed down from parent to child. So if parents are emotionally unavailable for any reason, the child will be left emotionally invalidated. And what that will result in is that the child not feeling like their emotions are important or that they're valid, and they also generally won't develop emotion skills and an emotional vocabulary. They won't be able to describe their own emotions. And even if the parents provide for the child with food and shelter, and even if they spend time with them, emotional neglect doesn't mean that the parents are not there. In fact, emotional neglect is most damaging when the parents are there, and the whole time the child is just desperate and wanting and longing and wondering, when is my parents, when is my mother, especially the mother. Emotional neglect mainly comes from the mother. When is my mother going to validate how I feel? Even if the mother's there the whole time, if there's no emotional validation, if there's no emotional connection, this is the development of emotional neglect from childhood, which in my opinion is a huge contributing factor, like a huge cause for borderline personality disorder and also other personality disorders, is emotional neglect. Because emotional dysregulation, in my opinion, is primarily caused by emotional invalidation, because when someone is emotionally invalidated, their emotions constantly build up, and what you're left with is emotional dysregulation, which is one of the fundamental core things that every single BPD and also narcissistic personality person has, is emotionally dysregulated. And this is caused by emotional invalidation. So the thing that makes emotional neglect from childhood so difficult to pinpoint and to correct is the fact that it is a very silent abuse. Emotional neglect is not something that is in the child's memory, in their conscious memory, because they don't remember all the time that anything bad actually happened to them. It's a slow, drawn out, silent abuse that is very damaging and emotionally dysregulates the person. And we're going to go through in a minute a few other things that it creates, okay? But the main thing is that it's hard to pinpoint because it's a silent abuse that happens to the child over time. Obviously, the child is trapped in this situation, okay, because they can't escape their childhood home. They can't escape their parents, okay? They didn't choose this situation. So the child more or less makes this emotional neglect part of their identity, okay? And we're going to go through some of the results of emotional neglect from childhood now as they grow up into an adult. Number one here is a very strong feeling of emptiness, depression, and loneliness. Okay, someone that was emotionally neglected as a child will often feel like that they are not human and that they're missing something very important, and they'll often feel that they don't belong with other people. And it's because that their emotional part of themselves, which is a very powerful part of a person's makeup, they have actually no contact with it. So they feel lonely, they often end up antisocial, social anxiety, depressed, obviously, because they don't have access to their emotions, and a feeling of emptiness, okay? They don't have strong feelings of joy and happiness. So this is number one. Emptiness, depression, and loneliness are more or less common with anyone that was emotionally neglected as a child. Number two is low emotional literacy. People that were emotionally neglected as children, they're not able to explain their emotions. They generally only have a few words to describe their emotions, and it's generally happy, sad, and empty. And that's pretty much it, okay? They're not able to describe their emotions with an emotional vocabulary. They don't feel their emotions are important. So they don't have any emotion skills, which makes connecting with other people very difficult, and for them to explain themselves is more or less impossible with their low emotional literacy. Number three is anemotophobia, which is a condition that results in a fear of emotions, okay? A fear of emotions, especially fear of negative emotions. This is a huge contributor of codependency and people-pleasing syndrome, where the person that was emotionally neglected as a child will do anything to not have to deal with someone else's negative emotions, okay? That's people-pleasing, trying to always keep people happy, trying to avoid any conversations or any content that revolves around someone else's negative feelings. The person will also not want to deal with their own negative emotions, okay? They'll constantly ignore them and push them to the side, which results in emotional dysregulation. So this is anemotophobia. It is a fear of negative emotions. Number four is poor decisions. Okay, so someone with emotional neglect from childhood will often make very poor life decisions, okay, and that's because a person's emotions play a very important role in making very important decisions, like how a person feels about things. So people that have a low emotional literacy and they're basically disconnected from their emotional part, which is called alexithymia, okay? They actually disidentify with their emotions. They don't know what they're feeling, okay? They don't know how they feel about decisions. A lot of the times they will actually get annoyed and frustrated if you want them to be involved in decision-making process for you. They'll often rely on other people to make decisions for them. This is all because they don't have access to their own emotions, because they were emotionally neglected and emotionally invalidated as a child. So when they make decisions, they'll often make a lot of mistakes, okay? They'll often get into dysfunctional relationships. They'll often end up in very detrimental situations, and this is because they're not able to access their emotional part, which plays a huge role in making life decisions, okay? So someone with emotional neglect from childhood will often make very poor decisions for their life. Number five is anger and rage. Okay, emotional dysregulation means that when they were a child and they were invalidated emotionally for a long period of time, if their parents were right in front of them and they weren't getting emotionally validated, this makes a person very angry and very enraged, okay? So this is also why the partners of borderline personality disorder people and also narcissistic people often end up very angry and frustrated and full of rage, okay? It's because that they're not being emotionally validated, and their feelings over time build up into massive amounts of pressure, which normally come out as anger and rage. So people with emotional neglect from childhood often have deep stored anger and rage, okay? And because they're not identifying with their feelings and they have dissociated and they're ignoring their feelings, they are very well buried, but they can come out at times. And the person that was emotionally neglected, they're very fearful of these negative emotions of anger and rage coming out. Okay, so again, they will tend to be very fearful of conflict. They will avoid conflict. They'll normally be people pleasing and, doing way too much to keep other people happy and to avoid getting into a conflict because they are not able to deal with the other person's negative emotions, and they also want to avoid huge outbursts of anger and of rage, okay? That's why people with emotional neglect from childhood always seek to avoid conflict, which is also not so healthy because a person has to be able to deal with conflict in their life. And that's something that people that were emotionally neglected as children suffer with, is anger and rage and avoiding conflict so that this anger and rage doesn't come out. Number 6 is a high risk for abuse. This has already more or less been explained, okay? People pleasing to avoid making other people show their negative emotions and stuff. Wanting to avoid their own anger and rage coming out. Not having good decisions. Not being able to access their feelings. Not being able to express their feelings. Okay, people with emotional neglect from childhood often end up in abusive situations and abusive relationships simply because they're not able to use their emotions and their feelings to navigate their way out of it. Normally, someone that was emotionally neglected as a child will have to provide reasons or excuses for everything. They often over-intellectualize and try and explain things intellectually instead of talking about their feelings. And this is a high risk for abuse, for abusive people to take advantage of this. And manipulative people, okay, people that come and manipulate the emotionally neglected person, it's very easy to do because they're not using their emotions to navigate their way away from abusive people, okay? So someone that was emotionally neglected as a child are very high risk of getting into abusive relationships as adults. And number 7, and lastly for today, is that their relationships, they suffer greatly, okay? Because human relationships rely on emotional connection, and especially in an intimate relationship, okay, with a spouse, with a partner, because they're not able to have access to their own emotions and they don't have emotional literacy and they seek to avoid the world of emotions, a spouse and a partner of someone with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder obviously, and emotional neglect, which in my opinion is the underlying cause of it all. It's one of the major contributing factors of borderline personality. The partner of someone with emotional neglect from childhood will also be emotionally neglected because the emotionally neglected person in their childhood, they weren't given the skills and the validation and the potential to have emotional connections with other people, okay? Because what they don't have for themselves, they're not able to give to other people. So their relationships suffer greatly, okay? Their friendships, even their family relationship could be very intellectual and very surface level and fake, okay? Not very emotional, no sharing of feelings. And as I said, in an intimate relationship, it suffers tremendously. The partner of someone with emotional neglect from childhood will also be emotionally neglected by them, which over time it's emotionally abusive to the partner. Over time it becomes very enraging and frustrating, huge amounts of resentment from the partner because they're not able to have an emotional connection with their intimate spouse, which over time makes the person feel lonely and empty, and they can even become angry and resentful. So this is emotional neglect from childhood. In my opinion, it is one of the fundamental causes of cluster B personality disorders such as borderline personality and narcissistic personality and other ones. Okay, so again, it is emotional invalidation from childhood, which causes these results and also other results as well. Emotional neglect from childhood is quite easy to overcome. It does take time. Borderline personality is certainly a part of emotional neglect from childhood. So if you are in a relationship where there's no emotional connection, your spouse is not emotionally available, or you yourself don't feel that you're able to be emotionally available for your spouse, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video.